Dispatch, I'm behind a black Mercedes heading east. Rain tapped against Officer Daniel Mercer's windshield as he narrowed his eyes. The expensive sedan moved smoothly through traffic. One glance at the driver was enough for Mercer to make up his mind. A suit, a luxury car, and he expects nobody to ask questions, he muttered. Without checking the plate, he reached for the switch. Blue lights flashed across the wet highway. The Mercedes slowed immediately and pulled onto the shoulder. Mercer stepped out, one hand resting near his holster. Water dripped from his cap as he approached the driver's window. "License." The driver looked up calmly. "Certainly, officer." He handed over the license without shaking. His voice carried no anger, no fear. Mercer frowned. "Registration. It is in the glove compartment. May I reach for it?" Mercer hesitated. He expected excuses, arguments, maybe panic. Instead, he found quiet respect. "Go ahead." The man opened the compartment slowly and passed over the papers. Mercer studied him. "Where are you coming from?" "A meeting downtown." "What kind of meeting?" "A professional one. You people always have professional meetings when you're stopped." The words hung in the cold air. The driver met his eyes without raising his voice. "Everyone has a story." "Officer." Something about the answer unsettled Mercer. There was no challenge in it. No attempt to impress him. Only steady confidence. Mercer looked back toward his cruiser, convincing himself he was still in control. Across the road, a parked SUV remained dark. Inside, someone quietly lowered a camera after recording every second of the stop. The observer made one phone call. "It started," the voice whispered. The call ended. Rain continued, falling. Neither Mercer nor the man inside the Mercedes realized the night's balance of power had already begun to change. "Forever. Step out of the vehicle, Marcus." Ellison looked through the rain-speckled window, then slowly opened the door. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You'll answer the questions." "Stand by the front of the car." Marcus nodded without protest. At 48, he had spent his life wearing a badge with honor. Only days earlier, he had accepted the appointment as the city's new police chief. Tonight, he had chosen to drive himself because leadership, to him, began on ordinary streets as Mercer watched him. Marcus remembered another roadside years before. His father had stood in the same rain, innocent but handcuffed. His mother never shouted afterward. She simply held his shoulder and whispered, "Never. Let someone else's prejudice decide who you become." Mercer's voice cut through the memory. "Hands." "Where I can see them," Marcus obeyed. Without asking permission, Mercer opened the Mercedes, searched the seats, and pulled open compartments. "What exactly are you looking for?" Marcus asked. "I'll decide that." Mercer pressed his radio. "Send me another unit." "Possible stolen vehicle." Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment, then looked back calmly. "You people always have a story," Mercer said. Marcus answered quietly. "Everyone has one." The words settled into the silence. Passing cars slowed. One driver raised a phone, then another. Soon several people were recording without saying a word. Mercer noticed them and straightened his shoulders. "Keep filming," he muttered. "You're about to see an arrest." Marcus remained still. "I hope," he said softly. "They see the whole truth." The distant sound of sirens grew louder. Blue lights reflected across the wet highway as backup vehicles approached. People kept recording. Mercer believed help was coming to support him. Marcus simply folded his hands and waited. Neither man realized the next few minutes would change the department forever. The first patrol car had barely stopped when more vehicles slowed along the shoulder. Doors opened. Nobody stepped forward to interfere. Instead, phones quietly rose into the air. A woman whispered, "I'm live." Another voice answered, "Keep recording." Within seconds, comments began flooding the live stream. "What's happening? Why are they treating him like that?" The flashing lights reflected across dozens of screens, creating a record no report could quietly erase later. Near the back of the gathering, a teenage boy watched Mercer circle Marcus again. He swallowed hard. "Something's wrong," he whispered. His friend looked from the phone to Marcus's calm face. "I think you're right." The words spread farther than either of them realized. People who had arrived believing the officer must be right now watched more carefully. Mercer noticed the growing crowd. Instead of lowering his voice, he stood taller. "Stay where you are," he barked. Marcus remained still. "I haven't moved." Mercer pointed toward the Mercedes. "You expect me to believe that's your car?" "I don't expect anything," Marcus replied. "Only fairness." The answer irritated Mercer even more. He turned toward the cameras. "I've handled situations like this for 20 years. At that moment, another cruiser arrived. Sergeant Lisa. Monroe stepped out, scanning the roadside before looking at Marcus with quiet curiosity. "Everything under control?" she asked. Mercer answered before anyone else could. "Routine stop. Drivers being investigated." Lisa sensed something didn't fit, but she couldn't place it. Marcus simply met her eyes and gave a polite nod. Before anyone spoke again, headlights appeared farther down them. Highway. An unmarked city SUV rolled steadily toward the scene. It slowed without its siren. The crowd instinctively stepped aside. Mercer glanced over his shoulder. For the first time that evening, certainty quietly began leaving his face. The SUV rolled onto the shoulder without flashing lights or rushing tires. Its quiet arrival felt strangely out of place among the patrol cars. Yet every conversation faded as heads slowly turned toward it. Even the live stream viewers sensed something had changed before anyone stepped outside. Mercer folded his arms and smirked. "Finally," he muttered. "Someone with authority." Officer Monroe glanced toward the vehicle. "Do you know who's inside?" "Doesn't matter," Mercer replied. "They're about to hear exactly what happened." The driver's door opened. A sharply dressed man stepped out, followed by a woman carrying a leather portfolio. Neither looked at Mercer. They walked calmly toward the Mercedes. Mercer's confidence only grew. "I told you," he whispered. "Procedure protects procedure." He straightened his uniform, expecting a handshake or quiet approval. Years of complaints had always ended the same way. Reports disappeared. Supervisors defended him. The system had never asked difficult questions before. The chief of staff stopped beside Marcus and offered a respectful nod. "Chief Ellison," he said gently. "We're waiting. The mayor and the council are ready whenever you are." The words settled over the roadside like heavy rain. Officer Monroe's eyes widened. "Chief?" Marcus gave a small nod. "Thank you. I needed to finish here first." The staff member looked toward Mercer without raising his voice. "Is there a problem, officer?" Mercer's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The confidence that had carried him for 2 decades disappeared in a single breath. Officers exchanged uncertain looks. Several bystanders lowered their phones, stunned into silence rather than excitement. Nobody cheered. Nobody argued. The recordings continued. Marcus calmly picked up his jacket from the driver's seat and closed the Mercedes door. "I believe we're finished here," he said. No one challenged him. For the first time that night, Mercer understood that authority borrowed from fear could vanish in seconds, while dignity earned through character remained standing long after every excuse had fallen silent. The silence on the roadside did not end the story. It exposed where it had truly begun. Long before Officer Daniel Mercer stopped Marcus Ellison's Mercedes, complaints had quietly disappeared behind department walls that rarely questioned their own. Reports arrived with signatures, witness statements, and photographs, only to vanish into locked cabinets before reaching anyone willing to act. Investigations ended with short explanations that satisfied administrators, but never the people who filed them. Inside the department, officers learned an unspoken lesson. Protect each other first. Protect the public second. In neighborhoods that carried the deepest scars, faith in justice slowly faded. Parents no longer promised their children that honesty would keep them safe. Instead, they offered different advice. Keep your hands where they can see them. Speak softly. Come home. Teenagers memorized those words before learning to drive. Residents stopped filing complaints because every unanswered report felt like another reminder that the outcome had already been decided. Mercer had never stood alone. Every supervisor who signed another closed file without asking harder questions added another brick to the wall protecting him. Reputation became more valuable than accountability. Promotions continued. Retirement parties were celebrated. Commendations filled personnel records while uncomfortable truths disappeared beneath official language. The damage rarely arrived through dramatic incidents alone. It grew through ordinary moments repeated thousands of times. Suspicious looks, unnecessary searches, questions asked only because of skin color, stops without clear reasons. Small humiliations became daily routine, until many officers stopped recognizing them as wrong. One person never accepted that silence. Internal Affairs investigator Rachel Kim watched reports disappear year after year. She argued at first, then realized arguments solved nothing inside closed offices. Quietly, she began making copies before files vanished. Body camera footage, witness interviews, internal emails. She labeled every folder carefully and stored them where no careless hand could erase them. She waited, believing truth sometimes required patience instead of noise. Rachel understood evidence meant little without the right moment. She watched chiefs retire with praise, while forgotten victims carried invisible wounds. Still, she preserved every document. That evening, after hearing what happened on the roadside, Rachel unlocked an old steel cabinet deep inside the evidence room. Dust drifted through the light as dozens of aging folders appeared exactly where she had hidden them years earlier. She spread them across the conference table, one beside another. Every name represented someone who had trusted the system before the system abandoned them. Outside, officers laughed as another ordinary shift continued. Inside, history finally waited for someone willing to read it. Rachel remained standing beside the conference table long after the building had grown quiet. She opened the first folder with careful hands, refusing to see it as another case number. Every page carried someone's worst memory. Every complaint represented a family forced to explain fear around the dinner table, a career interrupted by suspicion, or a child who learned too early that fairness could disappear beneath a flashing badge. The first file belonged to a college athlete. Coaches praised his discipline, classmates admired his talent, and scouts expected a bright future. Yet patrol reports showed he had been stopped repeatedly while driving to practice. Questions spread through campus before facts ever did. Some people whispered that police would not stop an innocent man so often. His scholarship survived, but his confidence never fully returned. Success had not protected him from assumptions. Rachel reached for another folder. A respected physician had documented 6 separate traffic stops within 2 years. Most occurred after exhausting hospital shifts when he was still wearing his medical identification. He wrote that officers rarely asked about his profession before ordering him out of the vehicle. Saving lives during the day changed nothing after sunset. His white coat disappeared, beneath the same suspicion waiting behind every flashing light. Another file forced Rachel to pause. Photographs showed a decorated military veteran lying face down on freezing pavement while neighbors watched from their porches. His medals and service record had earned respect overseas, yet they carried no weight beside his own driveway. Rachel quietly closed her eyes before reading the witness statements. A handwritten page slipped from another folder. I stopped believing anyone would listen. The sentence was short, uneven and written in fading ink. Rachel read it twice. Years of official reports suddenly felt smaller than those 7 words. She spread patrol logs across the table beside every complaint. Different victims, different neighborhoods, different years. One officer's name appeared again and again. Daniel Mercer. The pattern no longer required interpretation. It spoke for itself. Rachel arranged every file in chronological order until the stack stretched across the entire table. Separate stories became one continuous history of ignored warnings and protected misconduct. Outside the building, Marcus Ellison's traffic stop continued, spreading across television broadcasts and social media feeds. Inside the investigation room, Rachel understood the recording had only opened the door. These forgotten files would reveal something even greater. Mercer had not created the culture alone. The department had allowed it to grow until silence became policy. Instead of failure, the growing stack of complaints answered one question. But it also pointed Rachel back to another. Someone had finally decided the department could no longer continue pretending everything was normal. Months before Marcus Ellison ever stood beside his Mercedes on that rain-soaked highway, a quiet meeting had taken place behind the closed doors of the mayor's office, far from reporters, campaign speeches, and public attention. The mayor looked across the conference table before speaking. I asked you here because this conversation cannot leave this room, Marcus. Nodded, but remained silent. The mayor slid several folders across the table. Our department is losing the city's trust. Marcus opened the first file without interrupting. The mayor continued. This isn't about one bad officer anymore. Complaints disappear. Good officers stop speaking up. Entire neighborhoods believe the law depends on who you are instead of what you've done. Marcus closed the folder. Carefully, I've heard those stories my entire career. We need someone people can believe. Marcus leaned back and folded his hands. Changing uniforms changes nothing. The room fell quiet. The mayor studied him for several long seconds before answering. Changing leadership might neither. Man spoke immediately. Marcus looked through the office window, but his thoughts drifted somewhere else. He saw his father standing beside an old family car with his hands raised while strangers watched without helping. He remembered his mother's steady voice later that evening. Don't let bitterness choose your future. That lesson had stayed with him longer than the memory of flashing lights. The mayor finally broke the silence. I'm not asking you to save politics. I'm asking you to save the department before it destroys itself. Marcus lowered his eyes to the appointment papers waiting on the table. Accepting would place him inside the same institution that had once humiliated his family. Every decision would be questioned. Every reform resisted. Walking away would be easier, but easier had never changed anything. He picked up the pen and signed his name without ceremony. The mayor extended his hand. Thank you. Marcus returned the handshake. Don't thank me yet. The appointment remained confidential while transition plans quietly moved forward. Officers continued reporting for duty, unaware new leadership had already been chosen. Mercer never imagined the system protecting him had started changing beneath his feet. Rachel Kim kept organizing evidence, still waiting for someone willing to open every forgotten file. Across the city, families carried cautious hope, expecting another promise destined to fade. None realized that a single signature, written in complete silence, had already begun rewriting the department's future from within. While Marcus prepared quietly for the responsibility ahead, another story had been unfolding for decades without anyone forcing it to change. Daniel Mercer had not been born wearing a badge, but from childhood, he had been taught to see it as something beyond question. His father came home every evening in uniform, speaking proudly about duty, discipline, and respect. Whenever neighbors criticized the police, Mercer heard the same answer. They don't understand what officers go through. As a boy, he accepted those words without hesitation. To him, a badge never represented service first. It represented unquestioned authority. Years later, Mercer graduated from the academy, carrying that belief into every assignment. Senior officers praised his confidence. Supervisors complimented his command during traffic stops. Commendations arrived more often than criticism. Slowly, respect became something he expected instead of something he earned. Confidence stopped growing from good decisions and started growing from constant approval. The first complaint against him disappeared within weeks. Then another. Then another. Each time, union representatives defended him. Supervisors described the incidents as misunderstandings. Veteran officers reminded everyone that Mercer was experienced and dependable. No officer is perfect, they often said. The conversations ended there. Old department leaders worried more about protecting the badge than protecting public trust. Admitting serious misconduct, they believed, would damage confidence in the entire force. So uncomfortable questions remained unanswered, while familiar names continued receiving promotions and favorable evaluations. Mercer never believed he was becoming dangerous. He believed he was becoming effective. Ordering people from their vehicles felt routine. Searching without clear cause became ordinary. Speaking with suspicion before respect no longer seemed unusual. Years of authority had quietly reshaped his judgment until intimidation felt like professionalism instead of misconduct. Around him, silence sounded like agreement. Fellow officers rarely challenged him. Supervisors signed reports without hesitation. Citizens eventually stopped filing complaints because nothing changed. Mercer mistook the absence of consequences for proof that his actions were justified. His certainty had not appeared overnight. It had been carefully built by an institution that rewarded confidence while avoiding accountability. Every ignored warning strengthened habits that should have been corrected years earlier. Understanding that history did not excuse what Mercer had done. His upbringing explained his beliefs, his workplace reinforced them, his supervisors protected them, but every decision remained his own. Now the foundation beneath those beliefs had begun shifting. Marcus Ellison was preparing to lead differently. Rachel Kim had preserved evidence too powerful to ignore. Public attention refused to fade. Mercer still believed the system existed to shield him forever. He had not yet realized that the same institution which built his confidence was already preparing to dismantle it. One undeniable truth at a time. The footage spread faster than anyone inside the department had expected. By sunrise, television screens, mobile phones, and office computers all displayed the same traffic stop. What had once been dismissed as another routine encounter was now impossible to contain. The road where everything began was far behind them, but the questions it raised were only beginning to arrive. A producer adjusted her headset and looked toward the newsroom monitor. "Run the clip again. We've already aired it 6 times, then make it 7. Across the city, Marcus watched quietly from his office. He lowered the volume but never looked away. Every replay reminded him that the video alone was not the full story. The deeper truth still waited inside forgotten files. Meanwhile, Rachel Kim entered the station carrying another stack of recovered complaints. A detective glanced toward her. "More paperwork?" She answered softly. "More people." He looked at the folders, then lowered his eyes. Outside the building, reporters gathered near the entrance. How many complaints were filed against Officer Mercer? Did supervisors ignore warning signs? Who approved those investigations? Questions replaced assumptions. Inside neighborhood homes, families watched together in heavy silence. Elderly veterans sighed. "I told them this happened to me 15 years. Ago." His granddaughter squeezed his hand. "I believe you now." At a church fellowship hall, conversations grew louder. It wasn't just Marcus. "No," another man replied. "It never was." Even officers who had once defended Mercer stopped speaking with confidence. One whispered inside the locker room, "If those old files are real, this isn't ending anytime soon." His partner closed his locker carefully. "I think everyone already knows that." Mercer sat alone in his patrol vehicle, staring at his phone as notifications continued. Arriving. Another interview, another headline, another replay. He forced a thin smile. They're making a bigger deal than this. Deserves. Yet his voice sounded less certain than before. Across the country, viewers recognized pieces of their own lives inside the recording. The discussion was no longer about one officer making one decision. It had become a conversation about patterns repeated for years, protected by silence until one camera refused to blink. With every passing hour, public attention grew steadier, and the system that once seemed untouchable felt the first unmistakable signs of genuine accountability. The recordings continued reaching new audiences, but something even more important began happening afterward. People who had spent years carrying painful memories in silence slowly realized they were no longer standing alone. The courage shown by one man on a roadside had quietly opened a door for countless others who had been waiting for someone to believe them. On Sunday evening, the pews inside a small neighborhood church filled long before the service began. There were no television cameras inside, only neighbors sitting beside neighbors. The pastor looked around the room. "You don't have to speak," he said gently, "but if today is the day you finally can, we're here." An elderly woman stood first. "My grandson was stopped walking home from school," she paused. Fighting tears, I kept telling him everything would be okay. I wasn't sure I believed. No one interrupted. A young father slowly rose. "They searched my truck in front of my daughter." His voice cracked. She asked me later if I had done something bad. Across town, The community center overflowed with residents who had once believed complaints disappeared before reaching anyone who cared. A volunteer stepped forward. Tonight isn't about anger. It's about truth, one by one. People described unnecessary stops, disrespectful questions, and quiet humiliations that never appeared in official reports. Near the back, several former officers spoke behind a privacy screen. One cleared his throat. "We saw things. Why didn't you report them?" Someone asked softly. "We tried," another replied. After a while, people stopped listening. The room fell silent. Then a middle-aged woman approached the microphone. She folded a worn piece of paper before speaking. "I stopped believing anyone would..." Listen, nothing followed her words. Several. People wiped away tears. Others simply nodded, because they understood, without needing another explanation. That single sentence carried through every corner of the room, replacing isolation with recognition. News crews soon reported on similar gatherings across the city. Inside police headquarters, officers watched the broadcasts. Without their usual confidence, one patrol officer muted the television. "I've never heard this many people tell the same story." His partner answered quietly. "Maybe that's because we never wanted to," Rachel added, fresh. Witness statements beside the recovered files. Watching separate voices become one unmistakable pattern. Marcus listened from his office without making himself the center of the movement. He understood lasting change belonged to the community, not one leader. As churches, schools, and meeting halls filled with honest conversations, fear slowly surrendered to determination. The silence that had protected injustice for years finally began losing its grip, one calm voice after another, until ordinary people discovered that together, they could no longer be ignored. The voices rising across churches and community centers soon reached the offices where decisions were made. Public testimony had opened the conversation, but Rachel knew lasting accountability required more than emotion. It required evidence that could withstand every challenge, every denial, and every attempt to bury the past once again. She entered the Internal Affairs office carrying a slim folder. An investigator looked up. "Are we really reopening all of them?" Rachel nodded. "We're reopening everything. No shortcuts? Not this time." The room settled into determined silence as computers came alive and case numbers began appearing on screens that had ignored them for years. Storage rooms were unlocked before noon. Cardboard boxes covered in dust were rolled into the evidence office. A records clerk carefully removed faded folders. "I thought these were closed forever," Rachel answered without looking away. They were closed. They were never finished. Technical specialists worked through damaged databases late into the evening. One analyst suddenly leaned toward his monitor. "I found another deleted report. Can you recover it?" "I already did." More missing documents followed, revealing edits, unexplained changes, and investigation notes that had quietly disappeared years earlier. Nearby, another team reviewed archived dashcam recordings. Nobody spoke while the videos played. The cameras remembered details that paperwork had forgotten. A supervisor finally whispered, "We should have seen this years ago." Across headquarters, Mercer noticed something unusual. His phone remained silent. The lieutenant who normally greeted him walked past without stopping. Two officers ended their conversation the moment he entered the hallway. He forced a smile. "Busy day?" Neither answered immediately. "Looks that way," one finally muttered before walking away. For the first time in years, Mercer felt uncertainty following him instead of confidence. Inside conference rooms, supervisors weighed every sentence before speaking. No one rushed to defend him. No one volunteered familiar explanations. They say distance between Mercer and the department grew wider with every passing hour. Late that afternoon, Rachel entered the main conference room carrying several heavy archive boxes. She carefully removed one folder after another. Bought 1, 5, 10, 23. The stack covered the center of the table. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody checked Every investigator understood they were no longer looking at separate complaints but one continuous history. Rachel rested both hands on the files. "These people never knew each other," she said quietly. "Their stories did." Silence answered her. The documents required no dramatic argument because they reinforced one another with remarkable consistency. Patterns replaced excuses. Dates connected events, and forgotten evidence completed missing pieces. Around the table, experienced investigators recognized they were confronting years of institutional failure rather than isolated mistakes. Rachel saw the realization spread across every face. Meanwhile, Mercer sensed the foundation beneath his career quietly shifting. Procedures were now being followed without interference. Evidence remained protected, and leadership showed no interest in making uncomfortable truths disappear. For the first time since earning his badge, accountability stood closer to him than institutional protection ever had. The conference room emptied without celebration. Investigators carried files instead of opinions, and the weight of evidence settled over headquarters like quiet weather. As everyone returned to their desks, another arrival drew little attention, yet it carried far greater meaning than any stack of documents ever could. Marcus Ellison stepped through the front entrance alone. No cameras followed him, no reporters waited outside. Receptionist smiled politely. "Good morning." "Chief, good morning," Marcus replied. He signed the visitor log even though no one expected him to. An officer watching nearby whispered, "He could have skipped that," another answered. "Maybe that's the point." Marcus walked slowly through every hallway, greeting dispatchers, detectives, patrol officers, and custodians with the same calm respect. "Morning, how are things today?" He listened more than he spoke. Nobody heard him. Mention the traffic stop. Nobody heard him. Mention Daniel Mercer. Revenge never appeared in his expression. Rachel crossed paths with him outside the evidence office. "I've waited a long time for this day," she admitted. Marcus nodded. "So have a lot of people. We finally have the evidence. And now," he replied quietly, "we have to deserve their trust." Word spread that the new chief wanted every division assembled. For 5 minutes, the room filled quickly. Some officers stood confidently. Others folded their arms. Mercer remained near the back without saying a word. Marcus looked across the room before speaking. Integrity begins quietly, that was all. No long lecture. Followed no threats, no promises. He thanked everyone for coming and stepped away from the podium. The silence afterward lasted longer than the sentence itself. Several younger officers exchanged hopeful glances. One detective smiled faintly. "I've never heard so much said with so few words." An older sergeant answered, "Neither have I." Not everyone looked relieved. 2 longtime officers quietly avoided eye contact. One muttered, "Things are changing." His partner sighed. "They already have." Mercer watched Marcus leave the room. There was no anger, no public humiliation, only steady composure. For reasons he could not explain, that calm unsettled him more than any accusation ever could. Throughout the morning, reports were completed more carefully, conversations became more thoughtful, and routine decisions carried unusual attention. Rachel noticed the difference immediately. Honest officers seemed lighter, while others measured every action before taking it. Marcus never claimed victory because he understood leadership was not proven through speeches, but through consistent choices repeated every day. The department had not transformed overnight, yet something undeniable had shifted beneath its walls. Accountability no longer felt like a distant possibility. It had quietly become the new expectation, leaving comfortable silence with nowhere left to hide anymore. Morning arrived with a quiet tension that no one could ignore. The changes inside headquarters had led to this day, and long before the hearing officially opened, people were already gathering outside the municipal building. Some carried notebooks, others carried old photographs, while many simply carried memories they had waited years to have acknowledged. No one spoke very loudly. The crowd understood that history rarely announced itself with noise. Inside the hearing room, every chair filled one by one, until late arrivals were forced to stand along the back wall. Reporters checked their microphones without exchanging casual jokes. Community leaders greeted victims with respectful nods. Retired officers quietly took seats beside young recruits, creating a room where different generations would witness the same truth unfold together. A court employee looked around and whispered, "We've reached capacity." another replied. There are still people waiting outside. The doors opened. Again, as a family entered, an elderly woman recognized Rachel and offered a small smile. You remembered us, she said. Rachel returned the smile. Gently, I never forgot. Across the aisle, a young patrol officer glanced around the packed room. I've never seen anything like this, he admitted. His training officer answered softly, Neither have I. No applause greeted anyone. No angry chants echoed through the room. Only quiet anticipation settled over every seat. Marcus entered without drawing attention to himself. He acknowledged a few familiar faces with a nod before taking his place. His calm presence reminded many why they had continued believing change was still possible. Near the front, Mercer arrived moments later. He adjusted his jacket and scanned the audience, expecting reassuring faces. Instead, he found careful expressions and lowered eyes. Even those who once stood beside him now seemed unwilling to offer public support. The hearing had not yet begun, yet the atmosphere already felt different from every investigation before it. This room was no longer waiting for another explanation. It was waiting for answers, and every person present understood that whatever happened next would reach far beyond one officer, one complaint, or one department. The outcome would shape how justice was remembered for years ahead. The hearing room stayed silent long after the final exhibit disappeared from the screen. No one rushed to speak because every document, every recording, and every recovered report had already answered questions that had remained buried for years. The evidence no longer needed interpretation. It had formed a story too complete to ignore. The chairperson adjusted his glasses and looked across the panel. Officer Mercer, you may respond. Mercer cleared his throat. I've served this city for 20 years, no one interrupted. I made decisions based on experience. Every officer has difficult encounters. Looking back at isolated moments without understanding the pressure isn't fair. Rachel quietly slid another folder toward the panel. It isn't one moment, she said calmly. It's 23 documented complaints, supported by recordings, reports, witness statements, and internal correspondence. Mercer glanced toward the union. Representative. The man who had always nodded beside him kept his eyes on the table. Mercer's voice became quieter. People filed complaints because they were angry, Rachel answered without emotion. Some were angry. Some were frightened. Some never filed complaints at all, but the evidence still found them. Another investigator opened a summary timeline. Different years, he turned a page, different neighborhoods. Another page, different victims. He paused. The same conduct. Around the room, officers shifted in their seats. One captain slowly removed his reading glasses. Another folded his hands together without looking at Mercer. Marcus remained completely still. He had not celebrated a single piece of evidence, because this was never about winning against one man. It was about restoring confidence in a profession that depended on public trust. Mercer finally looked directly at Marcus. I suppose you've been waiting for this. Marcus answered quietly, No. The room listened. I was waiting for the truth to be heard. Nothing more. The sentence settled over everyone with surprising weight. Mercer's shoulders lowered for the first time that morning. Years of certainty had carried him through complaints, investigations, and uncomfortable meetings. This felt different. There were no arguments left to make. No missing reports, no forgotten witnesses, no supervisor willing to quietly close another file. Rachel closed the evidence binder and placed both hands on it. We have submitted every verified exhibit. The chairperson nodded. The record will reflect that. Outside, reporters waited for headlines. Inside, nobody moved. The panel members exchanged slow, thoughtful glances before organizing the documents into neat stacks. The hearing had reached a point where facts no longer competed with opinions. Truth had become the only voice remaining in the room, and every person present understood that whatever happened next would be built upon evidence that neither fear nor authority could erase again. The chairperson allowed a brief pause before calling the next witnesses. The panel will now hear testimony from members of the public. The rear doors opened quietly. Mercer's eyes followed the first man walking toward the witness table, then another, then a woman carrying a worn folder, then a younger man dressed in a business suit. Mercer's expression tightened. He recognized them, not by their names, by the traffic stops he had long ago forgotten. The veteran sat first. His medals were not displayed. He wore an ordinary jacket and folded his hands together. The chairperson nodded. "You may begin whenever you're ready." The veteran took a slow breath. "My name is Samuel Brooks." His voice never trembled. "I served this country for 24 years. He looked toward Mercer. "When I came home, I believed respect followed service." A long silence settled over the room. "One afternoon I was driving to visit my granddaughter." He swallowed. "I never made it there on time." Mercer lowered his eyes. Samuel continued. "I was ordered onto the pavement. I tried explaining I had done nothing wrong. No one listened." Another pause. "I wasn't afraid of being arrested." His voice softened. "I was afraid my granddaughter would remember seeing me treated like that." He looked directly at Mercer. "You took my dignity before you took my ID." Nobody moved. Even the reporters stopped writing. The sentence seemed to remain in the room long after it was spoken. Rachel quietly added Samuel's statement to the growing record. The next witness approached. A schoolteacher. "I started leaving home 20 minutes earlier every morning." The chairperson asked gently, "Why?" "Because I expected to be stopped." A small business owner followed. "My son asked why police looked at us differently. I didn't know how to answer." A college student adjusted the microphone. "I stopped applying for internships across town. Driving there made me anxious." One by one, the testimonies remained calm. No shouting, no accusations, only ordinary lives permanently reshaped by ordinary traffic stops that had never been ordinary at all. Mercer listened without interrupting. Each voice transformed another complaint number into a human face. Each memory replaced another excuse. Across the room, officers who once defended him avoided looking in his direction. Even the union representative remained motionless, his hands folded tightly together. Marcus watched every witness with quiet respect. He never interrupted. He never reacted. He simply allowed each person the dignity of being heard completely. When the final witness returned to their seat, the hearing room remained perfectly still. Rachel organized the signed statements beside the evidence already presented. The files had proven the facts. Now the people had revealed the cost. Mercer sat frozen, surrounded not by anger, but by lives forever changed. For the first time, the past stood directly before him, speaking with calm voices that neither authority nor silence could dismiss again. The last witness returned to a seat beside the other community members, and the hearing room remained wrapped in a silence that felt almost sacred. No one hurried the proceedings. The chairperson looked toward Marcus. "Chief Ellison, if you wish to make a statement, you may." Marcus stood slowly. He buttoned his jacket, glanced across the room, and rested one hand lightly on the table. "I don't have a long statement." His voice remained calm. "I've listened today." He looked briefly toward the witnesses. "I've heard courage." Then he turned toward the panel. "I've heard responsibility finally catching up with silence." No bitterness appeared in his face. No satisfaction. Only quiet resolve. He looked at Mercer for a brief moment before addressing everyone again. "This hearing isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliating anyone. It is about making sure the next family doesn't leave a traffic stop carrying the same memory for 20 years. The room stayed perfectly still. Marcus drew one careful breath. "I have one question." His eyes moved slowly across the panel. The officers, the reporters, and finally the citizens who had waited years to be heard. "Would this stop have happened if I looked different?" Nobody answered. The microphones remained silent. A reporter lowered her pen. One panel member removed his glasses but said nothing. Several officers stared at the floor. Rachel quietly watched every face around the room. She realized no document inside her evidence binder could have created a moment like this. Mercer swallowed hard. He searched for words that had always come easily before. Training, procedure, officer safety, experience. Each explanation rose into his thoughts before collapsing beneath everything the hearing had revealed. For the first time, none of them sounded true. He lowered his head. Across the gallery, Samuel Brooks folded his hands again. The school teacher sat motionless. The business owner closed his eyes. No one celebrated the silence because everyone understood its meaning. The unanswered question exposed more than policies ever had. It reached beneath paperwork and procedures to something far deeper. The chairperson looked around the room before quietly speaking. The record will reflect that no response has been offered. Marcus gave a respectful nod and returned to his seat without another word. Rachel closed her notebook gently. Even longtime supporters of Mercer no longer searched for arguments in his defense. Outside, television crews prepared breaking news reports. Inside, the hearing had become something greater than a disciplinary proceeding. It had become a mirror, held before an entire institution. No verdict had been announced. No punishment had yet been declared. Yet honest officers already understood. Reform could no longer wait. Community members sensed change had finally begun, and leaders recognized that trust would never return through promises alone. Sometimes justice begins with evidence. Sometimes it begins with courage. And sometimes the most powerful answer is the silence nobody can escape. The silence after Marcus's final question remained unbroken. No one hurried to fill it because every person in the hearing room understood that some truths became louder when nobody tried to explain them away. The panel members quietly reviewed their notes while investigators arranged the final documents into neat stacks. Mercer sat motionless, staring at the table instead of the people around him. For the first time that day, his shoulders sagged. The confidence that had carried him through countless complaints seemed to drain away without anyone saying a word. He took a slow breath, then another, but neither settled the growing weight pressing against his chest. His attorney leaned closer. "Daniel, stay composed. Nothing has been decided yet." Mercer nodded faintly. "I know." But his voice no longer carried certainty. Across the room, Rachel noticed his hands resting on the table. A slight tremor passed through his fingers before he quickly folded them together. Hoping no one had seen, she lowered her eyes to the evidence binder. The documents had already spoken. Mercer's wife watched from the gallery, her expression filled with confusion rather than anger. Their grown son quietly reached for her hand. "Dad doesn't look the same," he whispered. She answered softly, "No, he doesn't." Neither of them cried. They simply watched a man they thought they knew struggle beneath a truth he could no longer outrun. Near the back of the room, the union representative closed his notebook. Another officer quietly asked, "Are we saying anything afterward?" The representative shook his head. "There's nothing left to say," the answer spread through nearby rows without another conversation. Mercer slowly looked around the hearing room, faces that once greeted him with easy confidence now avoided his eyes. Officers who had laughed beside him in break rooms studied the floor or pretended to read paperwork. Nobody accused him. Nobody defended him either. That absence felt heavier than criticism. Marcus remained silent. He wasn't watching Mercer with satisfaction. He simply sat with calm composure, believing accountability should never become entertainment. Mercer's gaze briefly met the veteran's eyes. The older man gave no angry look, only quiet sadness. Mercer looked away first. For the first time in years, he stopped thinking about reports, policies, or discipline. Instead, he remembered every frightened face that had stood beside a roadside while he believed unquestioned authority was enough. "I never," he whispered. His attorney turned. "What?" Mercer swallowed. "I never thought they carried it this long." No one responded. The hearing room stayed respectfully still. Rachel closed the final evidence folder and placed both hands upon it. Around her, investigators exchanged silent glances, understanding they had reached the point where facts no longer required explanation. Outside, reporters waited for a decision. Inside, something far quieter had already happened, long before any official verdict. Mercer understood his career, his reputation, and the certainty that had defined his life were slipping away together. The badge on his chest still reflected the courtroom lights, yet it no longer felt like protection. It felt like a reminder, and in that heavy silence, he finally realized respect could never be enforced through authority. It had always needed to be earned. The silence following Marcus's final words lingered as every person in the hearing room remained seated. No one expected applause, arguments, or emotional speeches. The evidence, testimony, and unanswered question had already carried everyone to the same destination. The chairperson adjusted the microphone, opened the final report, and looked around the room before speaking with calm professionalism. The review board has reached its decision. No expression changed. No one interrupted. The evidence establishes repeated violations of departmental policy, abuse of authority, discriminatory conduct, and failure to uphold the standards required of a sworn officer. Each sentence landed with quiet certainty. Mercer stared ahead. His attorney slowly lowered his pen. The chairperson continued, Officer Daniel Mercer is hereby terminated from the police department, effective immediately. The words were neither loud nor dramatic, yet they erased 20 years of authority in a single announcement. Mercer closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. He offered no protest because every argument had already been answered by the evidence surrounding him. The report continued. Based upon the documented pattern of misconduct and evidence presented during these proceedings, this board formally recommends a federal investigation into departmental practices, supervisory failures, and institutional misconduct. A faint murmur passed through the audience before disappearing just as quickly. The decision had moved beyond one officer, now reached the entire system that had protected him. The key chairperson read the final disciplinary order. Officer Mercer's law enforcement certification is permanently revoked. No celebration followed. Several officers lowered their heads, others quietly released long breaths they had been holding for hours. The room understood the seriousness of removing legal authority from someone who had carried it for most of his adult life. The chairperson closed the report. This hearing is concluded. Marcus slowly stood. Every eye turned toward him. He spoke only once. Authority exists to protect dignity, nothing more. The sentence settled across the room with remarkable calm. One person rose to their feet, then another. Soon the entire hearing room stood together, not for Marcus alone, but for the principle his words represented. Honest officers, community leaders, investigators, victims, reporters, and ordinary citizens shared the same quiet gesture of respect. Rachel gathered the evidence binders with careful hands, knowing years of patient work had finally fulfilled their purpose. Mercer walked toward the exit without his badge, accompanied only by silence and reflection. Marcus remained behind for another moment, looking across the now empty chairs where truth had finally been allowed to stand without fear. The hearing ended without triumph or revenge. Instead, it left behind something far more lasting. The department had chosen accountability over protection. The community had been heard. Justice had spoken quietly, and because it spoke with honesty instead of anger, everyone understood its meaning would continue long after the room had emptied forever. The morning arrived without ceremony. Long before most of the department reported for duty, Daniel Mercer parked outside headquarters and sat quietly behind the wheel. For several minutes, he looked at the familiar entrance without reaching for the door handle. Finally, he stepped out carrying the small cardboard box he had brought for the last belongings he still needed to collect. The building greeted him with unusual silence. Mercer unlocked his locker one final time. The metal door creaked softly, revealing the same shelves he had opened almost every working day for 2 decades. Today, however, every movement felt unfamiliar. He removed a framed family photograph, an old academy notebook, several commendation certificates, and a worn coffee mug decorated with the department emblem. Each item disappeared quietly into the box without bringing the pride it once had. Outside the locker room, the hallway remained nearly empty. A few officers walked past on their way to briefing. Some glanced toward Mercer before looking ahead again. None stopped. No one offered criticism, forgiveness, or farewell. The silence felt complete enough to answer every question he no longer asked. Mercer reached for the final object. His badge rested inside the locker, exactly where he had placed it after the hearing. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. For years, the polished metal had represented certainty. Now it reflected something entirely different. Authority had never been the problem. The choices made while carrying that authority had been. After a long moment, he laid the badge back onto the empty shelf. It would remain there. Closing the locker felt heavier than locking it. Mercer lifted the cardboard box and started walking toward the exit. Although no crowd surrounded him, he carried the unmistakable feeling that every decision from his past walked beside him. Reputation, he finally understood, survived long after applause disappeared. No. Farewell gathering waited near the front entrance. No. Supervisor offered a final handshake. The absence of ceremony spoke louder than any speech ever could. Before reaching the doors, Mercer paused and looked back one last time. The hallway looked exactly as it always had. Officers continued their duties. Phones rang softly. Reports were delivered. The department kept moving without interruption. Marcus was nowhere in sight. He had chosen not to witness this departure because rebuilding trust mattered. More than watching one man's consequences unfold, Mercer stepped outside carrying only his box. Behind him, the locker remained closed. The badge remained inside, and the uniform no longer defined the future waiting ahead. The building stayed the same, only the man leaving it had truly changed. Mercer drove home through the same neighborhoods he had patrolled for years, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The streets were unchanged. The houses stood exactly where they always had, and children still played in front yards after school. Yet something invisible had shifted. A neighbor collecting the morning newspaper noticed him, offered a polite nod, then quietly returned inside without speaking. Mercer stood beside his mailbox for a moment before walking toward his front door. During the following days, the pattern continued. People who once waved from across the street suddenly seemed busy. Friendly conversations ended before they truly began. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings never arrived, and familiar smiles were replaced by brief acknowledgments, followed by uncomfortable silence. No one insulted him. No one needed to. One afternoon, Mercer placed his phone on the kitchen table and waited. He expected at least one former partner to call. Hours passed. Nothing. He checked for missed calls. There were none. But his voice no longer carried certainty. Across the room, Rachel noticed his hands resting on the table. A slight tremor passed through his fingers before he quickly folded them together. Hoping no one had seen, she lowered her eyes to the evidence binder. The documents had already spoken. Mercer's wife watched from the gallery, her expression filled with confusion rather than anger. Their grown son quietly reached for her hand. "Dad doesn't look the same," he whispered. She answered softly, "No, he doesn't." Neither of them cried. They simply watched a man they thought they knew struggle beneath a truth he could no longer outrun. Near the back of the room, the union representative closed his notebook. Another officer quietly asked, "Are we saying anything afterward?" The representative shook his head. "There's nothing left to say." The answer spread through nearby rows without another conversation. Mercer slowly looked around the hearing. Faces that once greeted him with easy confidence now avoided his eyes. Officers who had laughed beside him in break rooms studied the floor or pretended to read paperwork. Nobody accused him. Nobody defended him either. That absence felt heavier than criticism. Marcus remained silent. He wasn't watching Mercer with satisfaction. He simply sat with calm composure, believing accountability should never become entertainment. Mercer's gaze briefly met the veteran's eyes. The older man gave no angry look, only quiet sadness. Mercer looked away first. For the first time in years, he stopped thinking about reports, policies, or discipline. Instead, he remembered every frightened face that had stood beside a roadside while he believed unquestioned authority was enough. "I never," he whispered. His attorney turned. "What?" Mercer swallowed. "I never thought they carried it this long." No one responded. The hearing room stayed respectfully still. Rachel closed the final evidence folder and placed both hands upon it. Around her, investigators exchanged silent glances, understanding they had reached the point where facts no longer required explanation. Outside, reporters waited for a decision. Inside, something far quieter had already happened. Long before any official verdict, Mercer understood his career, his reputation, and the certainty that had defined his life were slipping away together. The badge on his chest still reflected the courtroom lights, yet it no longer felt like protection. It felt like a reminder, and in that heavy silence, he finally realized respect could never be enforced through authority. It had always needed to be earned. The silence following Marcus's final words lingered as every person in the hearing room remained seated. No one expected applause, arguments, or emotional speeches. The evidence, testimony, and unanswered question had already carried everyone to the same destination. The chairperson adjusted the microphone, opened the final report, and looked around the room before speaking with calm professionalism. The review board has reached its decision. No expression changed, no one interrupted. The evidence establishes repeated violations of departmental policy, abuse of authority, discriminatory conduct, and failure to uphold the standards required of a sworn officer. Each sentence landed with quiet certainty. Mercer stared ahead. His attorney slowly lowered his pen. The chairperson continued. Officer Daniel Mercer is hereby terminated from the police department, effective immediately. The words were neither loud nor dramatic, yet they erased 20 years of authority in a single announcement. Mercer closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. He offered no protest because every argument had already been answered by the evidence surrounding him. The report continued. Based upon the documented pattern of misconduct and evidence presented during these proceedings, this board formally recommends a federal investigation into departmental practices, supervisory failures, and institutional misconduct. A faint murmur passed through the audience before disappearing just as quickly. The decision had moved beyond one officer. It now reached the entire system that had protected him. The chairperson read the final disciplinary order. Officer, Mercer's law enforcement certification is permanently revoked. No celebration followed. Several officers lowered their heads. Others quietly released long breaths they had been holding for hours. The room understood the seriousness of removing legal authority from someone who had carried it for most of his adult life. The chairperson closed the report. This hearing is concluded. Marcus slowly stood. Every eye turned toward him. He spoke only once. Authority exists to protect dignity, nothing more. The sentence settled across the room with remarkable calm. One person rose to their feet, then another. Soon the entire hearing room stood together, not for Marcus alone, but for the principle his words represented. Honest officers, community leaders, investigators, victims, reporters, and ordinary citizens shared the same quiet gesture of respect. Rachel gathered the evidence binders with careful hands, knowing years of patient work had finally fulfilled their purpose. Mercer walked toward the exit without his badge, accompanied only by silence and reflection. Marcus remained behind for another moment, looking across the now empty chairs where truth had finally been allowed to stand without fear. The hearing ended without triumph or revenge. Instead, it left behind something far more lasting. The department had chosen accountability over protection. The community had been heard. Justice had spoken quietly. And because it spoke with honesty instead of anger, everyone understood its meaning would continue long after the room had emptied forever. The morning arrived without ceremony. Long before most of the department reported for duty, Daniel Mercer parked outside headquarters and sat quietly behind the wheel. For several minutes, he looked at the familiar entrance without reaching for the door handle. Finally, he stepped out carrying the small cardboard box he had brought for the last belongings he still needed to collect. The building greeted him with unusual silence. Mercer unlocked his locker. One final time, the metal door creaked softly, revealing the same shelves he had opened almost every working day for 2 decades. Today, however, every movement felt unfamiliar. He removed a framed family photograph, an old academy notebook, several commendation certificates, and a worn coffee mug decorated with the department emblem. Each item disappeared quietly into the box without bringing the pride it once had. Outside the locker room, the hallway remained nearly empty. A few officers walked past on their way to briefing. Some glanced toward Mercer before looking ahead again. None stopped. No one offered criticism, forgiveness, or farewell. The silence felt complete enough to answer every question he no longer asked. Mercer reached for the final object. His badge rested inside the locker exactly where he had placed it after the hearing. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. For years, the polished metal had represented certainty. Now it reflected something entirely different. Authority had never been the problem. The choices made while carrying that authority had been. After a long moment, he laid the badge back onto the empty shelf. It would remain there. Closing the locker felt heavier than locking it. Mercer lifted the cardboard box and started walking toward the exit. Although no crowd surrounded him, he carried the unmistakable feeling that every decision from his past walked beside him. Reputation, he finally understood, survived long after applause disappeared. No. Farewell gathering waited near the front entrance. No. Supervisor offered a final handshake. The absence of ceremony spoke louder than any speech ever could. Before reaching the doors, Mercer paused and looked back one last time. The hallway looked exactly as it always had. Officers continued their duties. Phones rang softly. Reports were delivered. The department kept moving without interruption. Marcus was nowhere in sight. He had chosen not to witness this departure because rebuilding trust mattered more than watching one man's consequences. Fold. Mercer stepped outside carrying only his box. Behind him, the locker remained closed. The badge remained inside, and the uniform no longer defined the future waiting ahead. The building stayed the same, only the man leaving it had truly changed. Mercer drove home through the same neighborhoods he had patrolled for years, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The streets were unchanged, the houses stood exactly where they always had, and children still played in front yards after school. Yet something invisible had shifted. A neighbor collecting the morning newspaper noticed him, offered a polite nod, then quietly returned inside without speaking. Mercer stood beside his mailbox for a moment, before walking toward his front door. During the following days, the pattern continued. People who once waved from across the street suddenly seemed busy. Friendly conversations ended before they truly began. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings never arrived, and familiar smiles were replaced by brief acknowledgments followed by uncomfortable silence. No one insulted him. No one needed to. One afternoon, Mercer placed his phone on the kitchen table and waited. He opened old message threads filled with years of conversations, shared photographs and promises of lifelong friendship. One by one, those voices had disappeared without explanation. The loyalty he believed would survive anything had quietly faded alongside the badge he no longer carried. He tried calling a retired captain. The call went to voicemail. Another former colleague replied only with a short text. Hope you're doing okay. He expected at least one former partner to call. Hours passed. Nothing. He checked for missed calls. There were none. When Marcus finally reached his destination, he stepped out of the car without celebration or attention. He simply closed the door and walked forward. The road behind him remained the same, but the people traveling it had changed. Weeks after the reforms began, the city gathered beneath an evening sky. Community members, officers, families, and leaders filled the public hall, not to celebrate a victory, but to recognize the responsibility that followed justice. Everyone understood that changing a system required more than one hearing, one decision, or one person standing at a podium. The room carried memories of what had happened before. Some people remembered the fear they once felt during ordinary encounters. Some officers remembered the questions they had been forced to ask themselves. Everyone understood that progress had come with a cost, but also with a responsibility to continue moving forward. Marcus Ellison stepped toward the microphone without confidence built from position or title. He carried the same calm presence that had guided him through every difficult moment. He did not look toward the cameras searching for approval. He did not speak as someone who had defeated an enemy. He spoke as someone who understood a responsibility. Tonight is not about one person, Marcus said. It is about what we choose to become. The crowd remained silent, listening, Marcus looked across the room at officers, families, and residents who had once stood on opposite sides of a history. Justice isn't measured by power, he said. It's measured by how we treat the person with the least power. The sentence moved through the room quietly. No applause followed. Instead, people sat with the meaning behind those words. They understood the journey had never been about watching one officer fall. It had been about ensuring no one else would be ignored the same way again. Marcus continued, reminding the department that a badge was never a symbol of superiority. A uniform gives you responsibility, he said. It does not give you permission to forget someone's humanity. Many officers lowered their eyes, reflecting on the lessons learned. Others looked forward, understanding that the future of their profession depended on choices made when nobody was watching. After the gathering ended, Marcus walked outside alone for a moment. The streets around him looked unchanged. The same roads connected the same neighborhoods. The same buildings stood beneath the same sky. But the people moving through those streets carried something different, a deeper understanding, a stronger expectation, a belief that respect should not depend on someone's background, position, or appearance. Driving home later that evening, Marcus followed the roads where his story had started. He remembered the flashing lights, the uncertainty, and the moment when silence surrounded him. But he also remembered the voices that followed, the people who finally spoke, the officers who chose accountability, and the community that refused to look away. He knew the work was not finished. Trust would require patience. Healing would require time. Mistakes would still happen. But the difference was that the city now had a foundation built on honesty. Instead of denial, change would continue through choices, an officer choosing respect, a citizen choosing hope, a leader choosing responsibility. Those moments would shape the future far more than any headline ever could. As the city lights appeared in the distance, Marcus understood the true meaning of the journey. The road itself had never changed. It was always just pavement, signs, and passing vehicles. What changed were the people traveling on it. They carried expectations. They carried awareness. They carried the courage to believe that justice was possible when people refused to protect silence. The story ended not with revenge, but with reflection, not with anger, but with accountability. The brightest light was never the one shining from a police cruiser. It was the light that revealed truth.